Welcome to Scholarship at the Cathedral, a series of public lectures delivered by eminent intellectuals and hosted by His Grace here in the beautiful and sacred surrounds of St Mary's Cathedral. Tonight's event is a partnership between Scholarship at the Cathedral and the Institute for Ethics and Society, a national research institute of the University of Notre Dame, Australia. We welcome Institute Director, Professor John Lippert, and his wife, Sylvie Margestedt. My name is John Rees, and I'm a member of the academic community of Notre Dame. Scholarship at the Cathedral aims to further the Sydney Archdiocese's contribution in the forum of intellectual life and public discourse. It is very pleasing to see so many people here once again. Welcome. Or, as we should rightfully celebrate, welcome back. It was only a few short weeks ago that we decided to test the post-COVID-19 waters by simply stepping out to host our first return public event. Within an unusually compressed time frame and COVID uncertainty, we released our promotion material and waited, wondering if anyone would come. And here you are. Indeed, the event reached capacity within a matter of days, perhaps highlighting our need to gather with really existing human beings once more, but also the importance of re-engaging matters that sit at the intersection of faith, reason, tradition, and public life. A note of housekeeping connected to a wider audience to inform that this evening is being live streamed and recorded, including the Q&A. It is therefore fitting that tonight's reopening lecture is delivered by His Grace. Archbishop Fisher was appointed by Pope Francis as the 9th Archbishop of Sydney in 2014. In 2015, he was also appointed to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and made an honorary member of the Pontifical Academy of St Thomas Aquinas. He has continued as a member of the Pontifical Academy for life. Archbishop Fisher is a scholar and public intellectual of influence who has published extensively in bioethics, moral theology, history, law, and spirituality. His most recent books include Catholic Bioethics for a New Millennium, Cambridge University Press, The Healing Peace of Christ, Reflections on Illness and Recovery, Death and New Life, and War and Terror, Peace and Hope, those last two works published by St Paul's. Would you join me in welcoming His Grace to the podium to deliver tonight's lecture titled Loss of Trust and Crisis of Leadership, Responses with the Help of St Thomas Aquinas. His Grace.
Thank you, and it is a joy to be back together with human beings in the flesh, to be actually able to shake a hand and read your faces so that when you can't understand a word I'm talking about, I'll get that and hopefully explain myself better. I knew it'd be too complicated for me. Good. Erosion of Trust, Part 1. Our world is suffering from a bad case of trust deficit disorder. So said the Secretary-General Antonio Guterres as he opened the 2018 General Assembly of the United Nations, marking the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. People are feeling troubled and insecure. Trust is at breaking point. Trust in national institutions, trust among states, trust in the rules-based global order. Within countries, people are losing faith in political establishments. Polarisation is on the rise, and populism is on the march. Among countries, cooperation is less certain and more difficult. World order is increasingly chaotic. We face a set of paradoxes. The world is more connected, yet societies are becoming more fragmented. Challenges are growing outward, while many are turning inward, he said. Many commentators have made similar observations. Just before COVID-19 hit, the annual Edelman Global Trust Barometer indicated that despite a strong global economy and high employment, most people in most countries surveyed distrusted government, corporations, NGOs, and the media. After a year of pandemic, economic downturn, political instability, and worldwide protests over climate change, sexual violence, and systemic racism, the subsequent report revealed an epidemic of misinformation and widespread mistrust of societal institutions and leaders around the world. Trust in the Catholic Church has taken a severe beating in recent years, especially in countries like our own, which have faced a clergy child sexual abuse crisis. While most of the criminal behaviour and failures of leadership occurred 30 to 50 years ago, much of it was only spotlighted more recently. The damage to children and families was immense and heartbreaking. The faith of many people was shaken. Pastors were left demoralised, and the credibility of the church seriously damaged. While much has now been done to bring justice and healing to survivors and to prevent recurrence of such things in the future, it may take generations for the necessary moral and structural conversion to be effected and for public confidence to be rebuilt. In the meantime, there is residual anger and distrust among many of the faithful and pastors, let alone amongst the media, governments, and the general public. There are signs of a similar disappointment with political institutions throughout the democratic world. According to the World Values Survey, since the early 1980s, the proportion of people who distrust their government has grown from half to 3/4 in the United States and Britain, and 2/3 in France. The rise of populist and protest politics reflects voter disillusionment with the political establishment and a loss of economic and cultural power amongst particular regions or social classes. The unemployed, poorly paid, young or anxious about work have the least investment in the status quo. High-profile cases of misuse of position have amplified the trope that politicians are all self-serving. Some politicians prey upon such disillusionment, sowing further seeds of doubt about democratic institutions. The media regularly magnify the sense of powerlessness and exclusion. In recent years, many previously trusted institutions such as the UN, the European Union and the World Bank, the British royal family and the American presidency, sports organisations and major corporations such as Lehman Brothers, Google, Facebook, Volkswagen and Boeing have all been publicly shamed. Financial, legal, police, prison, military, tech, entertainment and media institutions have been subjected to public scrutiny and found wanting. A similar disenchantment has occurred with respect to experts, such as scientists, and health officials have encountered considerable resistance to COVID safety measures. Not only are journalists permanent skeptics themselves, but most people are sceptical about journalists. Many people no longer feel safe on the streets. Conspiracy theories abound. Loneliness is rampant, and judgmentalism, manufactured outrage, and cancel culture thrive despite relativism. Some suggest the whole social compact, for which trust is the primary glue, is coming unstuck. Even if this is overstated, there can be little doubt that distrust has been rising in many quarters of modernity. Two, why declining trust matters. The effects of this global erosion of trust have been many. Francis Fukuyama, of End of History fame, observed that without a high degree of trust, complex modern societies struggle to sustain crucial institutions. In what Ross Douthat recently dubbed an era of decadence and disappointment, and others have called the culture of indignation, democracies have become deeply divided and increasingly dysfunctional, hostage to ideology, fear and anger, often resulting in short-sighted or extremist policies. Social divisions have worsened, opinions polarised, and many now view the world with suspicion. Then they seek to shore up their position with walls of various sorts, loyalty groups, engineered consent, or spin. Bureaucracies and workplaces increasingly rely on compliance, audit, and fear of litigation in lieu of trust. And much of life, not just the news, is presumed fake. Religious faith, empirical science, history, all are undermined by radical distrust. Rational argument and expertise are devalued. Confidences and promises broken. Candour doubted. And education increasingly fraught. Human relationships become ambiguous and insecure, and strangers treat each other with suspicion, disrespect, or hostility. In my specialist field of healthcare ethics, Edmund Pellegrino and Honora O'Neill argued persuasively that distrust imperils the therapeutic relationship. Beyond healthcare, many other professions and practices, for example law and order, are much more difficult with so little trust about. In the low-trust environment of post-liberal individualism, common decency and self-confidence are also imperilled, and it's difficult to maintain neighbourly relationships. In his article on trust, Hayden Ramsey gives an example. I stopped in front of a beautiful garden several doors from my own last spring. A woman was tending her plants behind a high fence. I said to her, "Your garden is so lovely. It cheers me up each day." The woman barely answered me. What did she fear? I had little power. She was safely inside. I had attempted to give positive and friendly signs. I think she felt I must be pretending friendship so I could gain her trust, to cheat, defraud, or otherwise harm her. She believes she has good reason to expect me to be other than I appear to be. Why social relations are in this state is a tough question. Which brings me to 3, the related crisis of leadership. Given the importance of personal, institutional and societal trust for effective leadership, and of good leadership for engendering and maintaining trust, it's unsurprising that a crisis of leadership would be observed at the same time as a deficit of trust. If most people distrust most institutions, they will especially distrust the leaders of those institutions. That will affect both the quality of leadership and its reception. In many places, anger regarding the clergy child sexual abuse crisis is directed more at the hierarchy than the perpetrators. The woeful inaction of ordinaries is said to have enabled the predators, made the vulnerable more so, and left victims without justice or healing. Critics say the bishops still don't get it, are only concerned to protect what is left of their assets and prestige, or lack the imagination and will to fix things. I think this wrongly universalises the failures or inadequacies of some and fails to get to the nub of what went so terribly wrong. But while anger is focused on church leaders, it has helped to accelerate needed reforms, but it's also diminished the credibility and morale of those who must lead such reforms. In some places, it's now increasingly difficult to find new bishops. A recent example of damaged church leadership might be the confusion over the permissibility of COVID-19 vaccines for Catholics, despite papal and curial clarifications that these are morally permissible, indeed strongly encouraged. Disillusionment with politicians as a class is also widespread, and this has contaminated attitudes to political parties, lobbyists and backers. Civic leaders are thought to be drawn from a narrow gene pool, to be out of touch with the concerns of ordinary people, to overpromise and underdeliver, to engage in narrow identity politics, and to serve their own or powerful sectional interests. Some think the system's so broken that even good-willed politicians will inevitably be corrupted or tamed, driven by the media and the electoral cycle. As in church and corporate leadership, this probably means some potentially excellent leaders are not putting their hands up for such roles. Beyond church and state, many institutions face a crisis of leadership. Spectacular failures of individual leaders and the perceived distance of leadership elites from ordinary people feed this negativity. Corporate leaders are widely perceived to put their own interests before those of their shareholders, their company's interests before their employees and customers, and short-term gains over long-term viability. This affects people's willingness to collaborate with them. Even if the crisis of leadership has been overhyped, it's obvious enough in many quarters today. Four, philosophy, scripture and tradition on trust. What is this thing called trust that is in such dangerously short supply today? From the considerable literature on trust, we can conclude that trust is the reliance one party, the trustor, places upon another, the trustee, to provide something the trustor desires: love, truth, help. But unlike mere reliance, trust requires a certain attitude or beliefs that this help is warranted or assured, such that a failure would be experienced as a letdown, even a betrayal. A decline in trust means a decline in that reliance or assurance, or from the trustor's point of view, in the trustee's trustworthiness. Because trust is so important, but also so risky, theorists have attended at length to what it is that makes trust warranted. They've distinguished prudential or earned trust based on experience or qualifications from instinctive or given trust based on common humanity, authority or relationship. Vertical trust, for example, between a citizen and leader, from horizontal trust between citizens, and spontaneous trust from reciprocal trust, and so on. The Bible and church teaching denounce trusting in idols. In nature, beauty, princes, armies, or money. We should entrust ourselves wholly to God, believe what he says, and practice those beliefs. The Psalter is full of such advice and includes songs of trust. In his words and works, we see that God is constant, true, and loving. To fail to rely on him is folly and self-defeating. Christ invites a filial trust in divine providence and mercy, counting not on our own strength, but prayerfully and humbly relying on the grace of the Holy Spirit. This brings peace and confidence, even in adversity. Though some die trusting in the Lord, their trust is ultimately rewarded. Scripture and tradition commend trust not just in God, but also in people. God gives humanity life, intellect and freedom, stewardship of the earth, and many opportunities. Christ assigns his word and sacraments to the church. To trust him is to trust those charged with preserving and transmitting his teachings. If human beings are to live in supportive communities, learn from each other, befriend and even marry each other, they must trust each other. As Pope Francis points out in Lumen Fidei, in many areas in our lives, we trust others who know more than we do. We trust the architect who builds our home, the pharmacist who gives us medicine for healing, the lawyer who defends us in court. We also need someone trustworthy and knowledgeable where God is concerned. Without a love which is trustworthy, nothing could truly keep men and women united. Human unity would be conceivable only on the basis of utility, on a calculus of conflicting interests, or on fear, but not on the goodness of living together, not on the joy which the mere presence of others can give. Faith makes us appreciate the architecture of human relationships because it grasps their ultimate foundation and definitive destiny in God, in his love. Thus, while certain roles are offices of trust, all the faithful should seek to be trustworthy, being God-fearing and neighbourly, keeping promises and confidences, eschewing lies and injustice. But we must be wary also of relying too much on ourselves and aware that all people are fallible and some untrustworthy. So some trust is reasonable, but so is some distrust. I come now to what St. Thomas Aquinas might teach us about these things. Those of you who've known me a bit over the years know he's my favourite. Theologian, philosopher, political scientist, bioethicist, cook, you name it. Although Aquinas does not give trust the dedicated attention he gives, for instance, to prudence or truth, the idea appears throughout his corpus. It features in his exegetical and theological works as a quasi-integral part of faith and hope, even if he doesn't name it as such. It also has implications in his writing for virtues such as charity, truthfulness, prudence and docility, magnanimity, law and justice, prayerfulness and sacrifice, affability, courage and humility. In his treatment of testimony, for instance, Aquinas recognises that we regularly and reasonably accept on authority many things we think we know, and that this investment of trust is required both for faith and reason. Distrust, on the other hand, feeds vices such as presumption, greed, idolatry and irreligion, obstinacy, worldliness, pusillanimity, even gluttony. The great expositor of Aquinas on trust is Marie George of St John's in Queens. She observes that when treating of faith and hope, Thomas uses the words initor and in horario, meaning to lean or rely upon, to fix upon or attach to indicate the secure support that one thing gives another. Elsewhere, he uses words like fido, credo, habeo fiduciam, and fiducia in ways that approximate to the word trust, as explicated above. In his disputed questions on hope, for instance, he observes, hope tends towards something good that is attainable and implies a certain confidence as to its attainment. Sometimes a man hopes to obtain something through his own power, sometimes indeed through the help of another whom he trusts will help. The impulse to hope necessarily has two aspects, namely in the good hoped for and the person trusted to help. Faith has the character of a virtue insofar as it trusts in the testimony of the first truth, believing those things it reveals. Hope also has the character of virtue in that a man trusts in the divine assistance, even for attaining eternal life. In many places, Thomas talks about our need to rely upon divine revelation, power, will, and mercy, upon Christ incarnate and in the sacraments, not on our own strength or worldly powers. Undermining trust in the scriptures, church, or miracles will, he thinks, inevitably undermine Christian faith. God, Thomas teaches, is not the only proper object of trust. In matters of faith and reason, theology and science, we assent to certain essential principles of speculative and practical reason, rely upon the facts as they present themselves, and trust those more experienced, prudent, or enlightened than ourselves. We trust the prophets, evangelists, magisterium. We also rightly turn to the saints or ask other men for certain things, he says. As for this reason, some are blamed if they cannot be trusted to help. Man is by nature a social animal, according to Aristotle. Anyone who either cannot lead a common life or is so self-sufficient as to not need to is either a beast or a god, he said. Aquinas echoes that view of our essential interconnectedness. And if we are social and political animals, we are trusting animals, bound together by language and customs and relying upon each other for many things. In his commentary on Boethius on the Trinity, he suggests, because in our common life it's necessary for one man to rely upon another, as if this other were himself, with respect to those things that he cannot attain by himself, so too it's necessary that we rely on those things which another knows and are unknown to himself. Thence it is that in human affairs it is necessary that one man believe the things said by another. And this is the foundation of justice. For Thomas, the earthly good for human beings includes experiencing life, truth, beauty, and moral goodness, which often requires assistance from others. But our good also includes friendship itself with God, family, friends, the church, and the civil community. On this account, human beings must live in community with others to achieve their proper ends and out of love of neighbour, trusting one another and collaborating. In his commentary on the Nicomachean Ethics, Aquinas says, a person owes trust and the sharing of things to his family and friends, and similarly to his extended family, tribe, and fellow citizens. When trust is systematically broken down, as happens, for instance, in totalitarian regimes, relationships are tense and much of ordinary life hazardous. Trust, then, is a social glue, the oil of smooth relationships. It's also a character trait. The virtuous person is both critically trusting and reasonably trustworthy. While some expectations are unreal or desperate, and trust comes in degrees, we mostly expect others to help, and we try to be helpful ourselves. Which brings me to 6, Aquinas on how to trust. How is it that we can trust? In what follows, I've reframed Mari George's reading of Aquinas on what makes trust assured. For Aquinas, there are 3 warrants for trust. First, disposition. As social animals, we naturally give each other the benefit of the doubt and expect others to be helpful. We trust taxi drivers not to give us philosophical formation. You go to the University of Notre Dame for that. Or to give us psychological counselling. We go to hairdressers for that. But to get us safely where we want to go. But we've all had the experience of cab drivers taking us for a ride, an expensive ride at that, often in some foreign city. So a certain amount of distrust is justified also. At the end of St. John's account of the cleansing of the temple, we are told that many believed in Jesus because of his miracles, but he did not trust himself to them. Thomas observes, "For Christ nothing was hidden of the things which are in a man. Knowing that they trusted him only imperfectly, he did not trust himself to them." To be trustworthy, the trustee must be good-willed, committed to truthfulness and common decency, generous, merciful, and just, or at least sufficiently so to be ready to help. Thus, the trustor must be disposed to trust because of present need or desire. I need your help. I need your love. I need to know something you know. And the trustee must be disposed to be trusted because of goodwill. I'm willing to give you what you need to know, what the love you are looking for. That is, both parties must be ready for trust. Secondly, choice. We rely upon God because we know He most deeply cares for us. There's no such thing as too much trust in God, as first truth and divine assistance. We also reasonably rely upon others. Sometimes they are complete strangers. More often, they are people we know: family, friends, state officials, pastors, physicians, or work colleagues. The concept of neighbour, deriving from the parable of the Good Samaritan and foundational to Western ethical and legal notions of duty of care and negligence, is of someone upon whom we can reasonably rely. Someone who chooses, that is willing, to make our concern theirs. Not to put too fine a point on it, they must actually give a damn. Some people are clearly more proximate, familiar, or committed to us than others. We are more inclined to approach them, and they are more inclined to make themselves accessible to us. Thus, the trustor must be familiar enough with the trustee to choose to rely upon them, and the trustee must choose to make the trustor's concern their own. Both must be willing for trust. Thirdly, competence. We assess someone's ability to help on the basis of their office, credentials, or relationship to us, their past behaviour or reputation, whether they have the knowledge or capacity to provide what we seek. Of course, all human beings are fallible, our judgments of their worth imperfect, and even those minded to help can prove unhelpful. This might be due to some character fault, as in criminals and those of ill repute, a defect of reason, as in the immature, insane, or overly emotional, internal bias, or external manipulation. This possibility of failed trust makes the trustor vulnerable to disappointment, and the greater the need or depth of trust, the more vulnerable. As Annette Beyer pointed out in her classic essays on trust, we then feel not only disappointed, but really let down, even betrayed. Nonetheless, we sometimes choose to trust even a fairly limited or unreliable person. Thus, the trustor must be capable of enduring the vulnerability and opportunity that trust brings, and the trustee must be competent to satisfy the trustor's need or desire. In other words, both parties must be able for trust. Ready, willing, and able. Having considered the nature and warrants of trust, according to St. Thomas, the three pressure points at which trust can fail, we can consider the implications for leadership. In his letter on kingship to the King of Cyprus and other texts, Aquinas offers thoughts on what good leadership of state, military, church, and family involves. The character required and roles of ordering, coordinating, and protecting, the meaning of law and requirements of justice. The great contemporary expositor of Aquinas' Law and Politics is John Finnis of Oxford and Notre Dame. He points out that as part of his broad interest in human action, Aquinas considered the dispositions and principles proper to those with responsibility for a community, as well as the pros and cons of various political arrangements. I'll not review the rival readings of Thomas's politics here tonight, but all agree that he thought the well-being of individuals depends upon there being in place a well-led church and state, families and intermediate institutions. At the beginning of his commentary on Aristotle's Ethics, Aquinas says that the purpose of a community is the flourishing of its members, and he elaborates there his crucial concept of the common good. Again, in the Summa Theologiae, he explains that the ultimate end of human life is happiness or beatitude. Since every part stands to the whole as incomplete stands to complete, and individual human beings are each parts of a complete community, law's appropriate concern is necessarily with directing towards common happiness, that is, to the common good. In On Kingship, he expands on this common good that leaders must advance. There are 3 requirements for the good life of a social group, he says. First, the society must be united in peace. Second, the members, thus united, must be directed towards acting well. And third, the king must work to ensure that there is a sufficient supply of the necessities for living well. The exercise of state power, then, according to Aquinas, is properly moderated by the following factors. First, the overarching goal of promoting and defending the common good by rebuffing enemies, suppressing crime, making good laws, providing for genuine needs, promoting virtue. Secondly, other moral principles and norms of justice. Then third, formal or customary constitutional provisions, for example, regarding succession, elections or appointments to office, terms, jurisdiction, and so on. And fifthly, proper respect for non-state institutions, especially church and family. Ecclesiastical power, Thomas says, is curtailed in parallel ways to state power. And church leaders have additional responsibilities to advance the kingdom of God. There are various views on what form of government best achieves these goals and observes these constraints. Aquinas follows Aristotle in arguing that concentrated authorities are more likely to get things done than more diffuse governments. But the less confident we are about our leaders, the more we will want them to share their power out. Here, historical experience and societal trust play out in constitutional arrangements. Aquinas prefers a mixed model with one clear leader or monarch, preferably elected, who governs all, but who does so in concert with an aristocracy of high officials, chosen for their excellence of character and aptitude, along with a democracy of many citizens entitled to vote and participate in the polity in other ways. Reflecting the mixed modes of government in the new religious orders of friars and the emerging city-states, Aquinas thought such government, though less efficient, was safer than more monarchical styles in church and state till then. Or indeed, the more absolutist monarchies and more military models of religious life that would appear in the subsequent centuries. But in the end, someone must decide. Just as one king bee leads every hive, so St. Thomas thought, so a single leader is both more natural and more likely to unite people. Trust comes into play at many other points in his exposition of the ends and means of leadership. Law is an ordinance of reason for the common good of a community, promulgated by the one or ones responsible for looking after that community. It's thus a means of coordination through free cooperation, and involves an implicit appeal to the mind and will of those it seeks to bind. When leaders put personal or sectional interests before those of the community, or act in other ways that are unjust or ultra vires, or dictate wrongful actions, they undermine respect for their institution and themselves, and make people less likely to collaborate with them. A good leader, on Aquinas' account, loves those she governs and accepts the role of leading them, is practically wise, just and focused on the common good, is magnanimous and humble, offering an elevating vision of community, of a community of safe, virtuous and fulfilled people, courageously perseveres with sound policy despite opposition, abides by proper limits to authority and appoints worthy people to offices, delegating or sharing governance appropriately, and leads by example, doing works that express greatness of soul and inspire the members. Which brings me to 8, addressing the trust and leadership crisis. So what might Aquinas say to our contemporary trust deficit and leadership crisis? And here I want to conclude tonight with 5 points, at least to be getting on with, that I think Aquinas would say would offer for our present situation. First, I think he would say there is no simple solution. Trust is a kind of social capital that takes a long while to build up, yet can be torn down in short order. Disillusionment with religious and political leaders and with major institutions may take generations to be corrected. Christ's promise that the church will endure is no surety against decline in size or fervour at particular times or places. And as for the state and various institutions and professions, there are no guarantees even of survival. Secondly, we must be willing to trust others and follow our leaders. Aquinas would regard contemporary cynicism about institutions and authority as essentially a moral and spiritual problem, requiring instruction and correction. With the scriptures and fathers, he would counsel Christians to reorder what they rely upon, carefully discerning who will best form and support them. They must play their part in family, neighbourhood, church, associations, city and nation. If growing inequality is a significant cause of people losing faith in the establishment, there must be serious efforts to address this and other causes of polarisation and division. In that vein, several commentators have called for urgent action to rediscover relationships and rootedness, reduce tensions, and promote civil debate and discourse in place of rancour, demonisation, and cancel culture. The detraction and vilification so common today must be called out for the vices they are. We might also explore in a fresh way unfashionable virtues like docility and obedience, and promote genuine transformation of character rather than virtue signalling. A communitarian ethic in place of atomistic individualism. Yuval Levin has recently argued that our freedoms will depend upon such individual and institutional renewal, and the consequent renewal of our confidence in leaders. Third, some must lead, even in difficult times. Church, state and corporate leaders, on Thomas's account, must recognise that theirs is an office of trust and seek to deserve the trust of those they lead. Fundamental conversion of character and life may be required for leaders to be regarded as trustworthy. Leaders today are expected to demonstrate vision and creativity, efficiency and effectiveness, honesty and integrity, fairness and empathy, truthfulness and transparency. On the last of those, St. Thomas says, since man is a social animal, each man naturally owes the other whatever is necessary for the preservation of human society. Now, it would be impossible for men to live well together unless they trusted one another to be telling each other the truth. Hence, the virtue of truthfulness, called transparency these days, is something essential to a just society. Fourthly, leaders must address particular failings of their institutions and consequent perceptions of untrustworthiness. For church leaders to regain credibility and popular confidence today will require apology and redress to the victims of past failures, systemic change to ensure child safety, and greater accountability and shared governance, consonant with a Catholic ecclesiology and spirituality. After Simon Peter's triple betrayal came his triple or perfect act of contrition, his Pentecost inspiration, and his unflinching fidelity to Christ and the mission thereafter. Today's church leaders must also seek holiness, humility after the recent humiliations, new life after the pruning, and asceticism, St. Thomas suggests, of relying not on the riches of their position and eloquence, but on God's power alone. In dark times for the church, leaders may simply have to hold on faithfully and persevere, as like Peter, they are led where they would rather not go. Likewise, in politics, leaders have much to do to regain people's trust. In accord with Thomas' thinking that I've enunciated tonight, this may require much greater efforts by leaders to unite their community in peace, rather than dividing it for political purposes, to appeal to a broader base, rather than a faction of a divided community, to offer an inspiring vision with which people will willingly collaborate, to ensure systemic reform that will regain public confidence, and to make again the public case for democracy and educate citizens on its nature and rationale. Groucho Marx famously said, "The secret of life is honesty and fair dealing. If you can fake that, you've got it made." The corporate instinct in the face of the challenges I've identified today can be to seek PR assistance. Robert Phillips has argued, however, that business leaders can only regain the trust of shareholders, employees, customers and regulators by a deep change of attitude and behaviour. The emphasis must be on integrity, doing the right thing, rather than compliance, purpose before profit, governance of a high standard, and focus on the common good of each business and those it serves. Several scholars of corporate leadership have proposed old-fashioned virtues like truthfulness, justice and prudence as essential to restoring public confidence, rather than engaging in virtue signalling through corporate activism. Other institutions may also require radical change if they are to regain popular trust. Fifthly, and lastly, while this lecture has focused on the erosion of trust and related crisis of leadership, it must be recognised that there can be too much trust and too blind an obedience. In some situations, more distrust, scrutiny and resistance to authority are in order. To say we need to recover appropriate trust in institutions and each other, and appropriate submission to good leaders, is not the same as saying we should naively trust everyone or follow every would-be leader wherever they are proposing to take us. Which brings me to my conclusion. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis recently critiqued ideologies that breed mistrust, fomenting suspicion and resentment, especially towards strangers, and serving to marginalise them, or that promote an individualism that turns others into rivals rather than potential friends. Christian fraternity, solidarity, and communion are a different path. The Holy Father exhorts young people to trust in the spiritual and human riches inherited from past generations, and to use the new technologies to share lives appropriately rather than indulge in linguistic violence, deception, or walling themselves up. Like Jesus and Aquinas, Pope Francis proposes the Good Samaritan as our model here. As we rebuild neighbourhoods, polities, markets, and international relations founded on trust rather than fear. Such newfound reliance on each other will require patience, forgiveness, mutual respect, deep listening, and genuine dialogue. The Pope's call could not be more timely when so many commentators are identifying a radical erosion of trust, especially in major institutions, and a related crisis of leadership, both of which play out in many negative ways in people's lives. In this lecture tonight, I've sought to unpack the what, whom, why, and how of trust with the help of St. Thomas Aquinas, the most reliable of guides, especially his 3 warrants, without which one party will not trust another: disposition, choice, and competence. These must be the 3 starting points for any recovery of trust on both sides. I also examined some of Aquinas' related thoughts on leadership and offered some proposals for addressing current challenges. Rebuilding trust in leaders will require those for whom they are responsible to be ready, willing, and able to trust them, and that those charged to lead be ready, willing, and able to be trusted. That may require significant change on both sides, and for this we must work and pray. In this era of contested realities and hermeneutics of suspicion, we might usefully hear again St. Thomas's syllogism of trust. That without which human society cannot be preserved is above all necessary both for the individual and for the community. But without trust, human society cannot be sustained. For if men are to remain together, they must be able to believe each other's promises, testimony, and other things of this sort. Therefore, trust is in the highest degree necessary to humankind. Thank you.
We trust, as you've been listening to His Grace, and thank you, Archbishop, for such wise and timely words, that you have had questions that may relate to your personal or professional life around trust and how we engage it. And we might begin with the question on the relationship, Your Grace, between trust and discernment. The drums of an election are starting to beat, and we are all electors. How do we exercise the principles of Thomas Aquinas in a context of trust or the struggle to trust as we head to the ballot box?
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. I think many of us are pretty cynical about political parties, their platforms, whether leaders have any intention of fulfilling what they promise, and therefore discerning who to elect is often an exercise in discerning who I distrust least, who I think will do the least harm, who I find least antipathetic to everything I stand for. Now that's a very bad way for things to be, according to Thomas. On Thomas's view, our leaders should be people who inspire us, who give us hope and vision and lead by the example of their own greatness of soul, greatness of spirit. They should be people. He's not naive. He had leaders in his own family and they're often pretty corrupt, but he knew what they should be like and could be like. And so the first thing I'd say about discernment in politics is we shouldn't accept that what we've got is how it has to be or is the only way it's going to be. We've got to do better. Secondly, that said, that there's lots of problems with our leaders and our leadership class in politics, we've got to be better citizens too. And to be so consumed by cynicism is very damaging to the polity. It's very damaging to a democracy if the citizens can't honestly say, you are my representative, my representatives. I trust you to govern me. I won't always agree with you, but I've put you there to govern me, or we have collectively put you there to govern me, and we're going to trust when you make your laws and policies, that will mostly be for the good. Now, if we can't say that, we've basically given up on democracy. We're just kind of putting up with what we've got, but we don't really believe in it anymore. And that's as damaging as having bad leaders is having bad citizens, people that don't believe in the polity anymore. So we have to, it requires a reform of life and character, both for leaders and led, both for the voter discerning who to elect and those standing for election.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Francis Campbell.
Thank you, John. Your Grace, I was wondering, perhaps a rather cheeky question, but...
What I would expect from the Vice-Chancellor.
If St. Thomas were to perhaps choose a modern political leader that most reflected this definition of leadership, who do you think he would choose?
Oh dear. Help me, someone. Can we think of one? Mrs. Merkel. Oh, well, she's not as bad as some others, that's for sure. Look, we don't have a lot of very inspiring leaders at the moment, do we? Like even to look at, do we have anyone that says things that excite us, that give us, a vision, give us something that will take us forward as a community? Do we hear any good rhetoric from political leaders? Not a lot in this generation. Do we see examples of an heroic life that would make us want to follow that person? I can't think of many at the moment. But can you name one for us, Vice-Chancellor? Yes. Well, look, maybe that person's in this room a future leader. Maybe we've got to make for leaders worthy of respect and trust. And that means we've got to be much more engaged in politics, all of us, in one way or another. In my case, mostly by praying for them, sometimes by lobbying or speaking out, but mostly by prayer. But for some of you, it might be by being our future representatives and leaders.
Thanks, Chris. Is that on? Hi. I had a question about the 3 warrants that was really intrigued me and also troubled me a little bit. The reciprocity, and I find it interesting to have the 2 sides of it as well. But I just wonder where to start, or where Aquinas thinks we should start. I mean, the idea that I have to know the other person well enough to be able to, make a judgment on trusting that person seems very difficult when we encounter a stranger, for example. Mm-hmm. So I was reminded of the Hayden Ramsey quote he had at the beginning about meeting someone with a garden fence, and there seems to be this element of mistrust. So I wonder where's the first, if the first step has not to be a leap of faith to some extent, where it's a one-sided step in that direction, in the hope that that would happen. So.
Well, it's a good thought. I think Thomas would say that even trusting a stranger is not a leap of faith, because he thinks we have a common humanity that means we naturally should be trustworthy. We naturally should want to help each other. There's something gone wrong in us if we in fact are dangerous and liars and untrustworthy. So in general, we would rightly trust, if I'm in a foreign city and I stop someone and ask them for directions, I will generally trust that they'll point me in the right direction. If they're in Ireland, they'll make some fun with me and probably send me in completely the wrong direction. But most places, that would be their natural instinct. Even though I don't know them, in fact, I don't even know their country, their people, they're as alien to me as they could be. So he thinks our common humanity is the beginning of trust. And then as we build up the relationship, then we'll have more and more cause to trust. So the Good Samaritan who stops for an injured man on the road doesn't know him at all. In fact, they're from opposite tribes, rival tribes, but he demonstrates his trustworthiness just by an exercise of common humanity and care, and presumably earns the victim's trust. And that's a starting point, just being humane human beings towards each other. And then after that, there'll be more and more reason to trust as we have more experience of each other, build up stronger relationships, set in place various customs and institutions that kind of set in place relationships of trust to take us forward.
We have several questions from the back of the room.
Thank you, Archbishop. I've got a question with something of a preamble. You touched on integrity, which I think is essential to trust. I'd like to just wager a definition that it would be what I think is an embodied truthfulness, when someone's actions and words and beliefs all line up. And to me, there's no better example than the disciples and early martyrs who gave their lives for what they believed. You could really trust what they saw, what they said they saw. I think some of the distrust within society is due to the fact that we have been given images of people like politicians, and then scandals have arisen to show that the image is a falsehood. And so there's a lack of integrity. Noting that example that is sort of the ideal, how do we show that integrity without necessarily dying for our faith, if that makes sense?
Okay, thank you. If I could start with your first point, I think heroes are very often for us examples of the kind of people we want to trust, we know we can trust, we wish people were like that so we could trust each other more. So those saints, martyrs, heroes of various kinds often represent the most trustworthy people. They're the people that love best, that help best, that know and share their knowledge best, and so on. So give us more heroes, give us more saints and martyrs, and we'll have more trust, for sure. I think this is also why we are so disappointed when church leaders let us down, because they should be holier. They should be, what they represent should be better than what the world gives us. And sometimes they turn out to be worse. And so we're even more disillusioned with a failed saint, a failed church person, than we would be with someone that doesn't profess such high ideals. But also our political leaders, we do ask them to be embodiments of our polity, of our democracy, of its highest ideals. And when they don't seem to be that, even remotely, when they're not heroic examples of our democracy, of leadership, then again we're very disillusioned. It's not just ordinary, oh, I feel a bit let down. It's that Annette Byers sense that we feel deeply betrayed when a trust is broken. So integrity, which is a complex notion, it includes both a kind of integration of character, so that the external and internal me are the same me. The will and the intellect are in collaborating well. There's a certain unity between the good, the truly objectively good, and my life. It's integration on many different levels for a person to be a person of integrity. But where that is missing, trust is damaged so quickly and radically. And you see that, we've seen that in the church in recent years, and we've seen that in the polity.
Your Grace, thank you for your talk tonight, and I found it very engaging. I'd just like to bring your attention to an idea that I've just been thinking about over the past the past hour that I've been listening to your talk. And I'll start off by saying that I think with regard to trust, I think that when we have a really personal relationship with, say, our local priests that we see every single day, we really build up a good relationship because we see them for spiritual advice and like spiritual direction, really. And I would just like to pose to you what would be your sort of thinking towards setting up of vocational places for laymen and for people who discern in their lives to be a bit more engaged with the church, such as an oratory or a place of spiritual worship. What would be your thoughts as to that?
Well, thank you. You might know we've set up a place called Sumner House in our diocese to be a place for some young men to be contemplating their vocation and doing that in a healthy, supportive way. Not that I'm expecting most of them to be priests. I think most of them will be something else, but one way or another I hope they will be the better for that time together. And there's discussions going on about having a similar house for women, and then people are now pushing me, we need more than one for men, and Broken Bay's recently opened one too. So I think it's a good thought that we do need to help people to discern their life course with a good supportive environment rather than one that's going to lead them in many bad directions, for sure. I think you're right also to say it's very important to have someone you feel you can trust spiritually. And I said before that part of why we're so angry and disappointed, disillusioned by the child sexual abuse thing is that these should have been the men we could most trust, and they abused the trust terribly and hurt our little ones and hurt all of us. But we shouldn't give up on the notion that we do actually need to trust people spiritually. We need some people who I can speak to in complete confidence, who I can reveal my deepest soul and my terrible temptations and the ways I've failed, as well as my hopes and aspirations. And that might be a confessor, that might be a wise old aunt who's the wisest person in my family. It might be a best friend, but we need someone or someones with whom we can be totally confident to open our hearts, and who will call us to more and better, rather than just pat us when we're at our worst and say, keep being bad. And so whether that's going to be a spiritual director or something less formal but possibly serving a similar purpose in your life, I think we all need some of that.
We have a question from up the back, and at last, someone from this side of the room as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask, it's obviously a very personal topic for you because you are leading a church that has a crisis of trust, a very difficult position to be in. I mean, what on a personal level has that been like?
Horrible. There's no minimising this. It's been very ugly for us all. And above all, because I love young people and the little ones have been hurt, terribly hurt, damaged for life in many cases. And the responsibility to do all we can to bring healing and justice for them is huge, but in the end I know in this life it's not going to be fixed for many of them. And that's a terrible burden that I think the Christian community has to carry, including me, even though I'm the age of the victims. It was happening when I was a boy. It wasn't my generation doing it, but my generation suffering it. But I still carry something of the burden of our history. I think we have to do that. It's horrible, but it's my time in history. That's God's put me here now with this job. And so I've got to do my best to lead the church through this, at least my bit of the church's leadership, and not shy away from that, not hide under my bed or pretend it didn't happen or pretend it's not my job to do anything about it or any of the other natural human responses. No, I've just got to get in there and do my best to make things better, to make sure this never happens again, and that eventually we will earn people's trust again, including our own people's trust where it's been terribly damaged. I mightn't see that in my lifetime, but I'll at least be trying to get us there and handing on what's left to the next generation to lead us forward. That's how I see it. It's not easy, it's not all fun, but it's my time, and I'm not being fed to lions. I'm not being tortured by being bled upside down in Japan. Okay, we've got our burdens, but they're not what many Christians have been through in history.
We have one question here, and then a final question from the front. Thank you.
Grace, your opening comments were quite bleak in terms of your assessment of trust in modernity. So what on earth do you make of the fact that 10 years ago I could buy a Bitcoin for 10 cents, and as of 10 days ago they were worth $65,000 a piece, and it's merely a fiat currency, which is a long stretch from the original act of trust that we associated with the great fiat of another person?
Yes. Look, I don't understand Bitcoin. I believe it just kind of collapsed recently too, but it's clearly built on a kind of a world of a kind of gambling that is people imagine as investment, but it's probably more like a casino. And I don't know if trust is even the right word there, because I don't think it's, in terms of Thomas's thought, that there are not the warrants of trust. They're all missing. All three of them are missing in that kind of gambling. It's something else going on. It's the thrill of danger, or it's the greed that means I trust totally in wealth. It's Thomas's thought that greed is a kind of misplaced trust. There's something else going on here, that not real trust. Now, that said, I've mentioned that people can trust too much as well as trusting too little, and sometimes there's an irrational trust, that people trust in the wrong thing or to the wrong degree for the wrong reasons, whatever. And I've been interested in that Edelman survey of world trust that I was quoting. The country in the world that has swum most against that tide is Australia, where trust has risen during COVID. Everywhere else it's fallen, but in Australia it's risen. And that's weird and interesting to reflect on why we're so trusting. Our level of trust in government, in NGOs, in scientists, in corporations, they've all gone up during COVID. Why are we so compliant? Probably the most compliant people on earth. It amazed me when it happened, but it's taught me about myself and my people, things I hadn't seen before. Well, maybe we're too trusting sometimes, or it's an irrational trust. It's the wrong kind of trust and the wrong thing. But maybe there's something to build on here that's good too.
We have a question from Patrick Langrel.
Thanks. Archbishop, my question connects a little bit to just your answer to this one, but I was wondering, when people consider trust in the nature of a friendship of equals, so two persons, and one person betrays that person's trust, often that can lead to long-lasting effects for maybe many years. One or both parties will not trust each other. And there might be an analogy there between sort of institutions as well, and how it takes time, I guess, to recover. I guess to play devil's advocate a little bit, I'm just wondering, connected to what you said, is using the word trust for those larger, more social relationships, the ones between institutions and communities, is that trying to do too much work there? Is there a possibility of sort of making more personal the betrayal aspect of that trust, such that maybe other words like reliance, which don't seem to come with the same level of personal baggage with a brokenness to that, is trust, in other words, trying to do too much when talking between those wider relations than more personal settings?
Well, I think that's a very interesting thought. I think it may be that we use the word in a very elastic way, and even analogically or metaphorically, not literally in some contexts when we use the word trust. I don't think we're using it any more elastically there than we're using a word like friendship, which you averted to, and we talk of friendship with God, who is in no way our equal, but we have a friendship with this very unequal, as well as friendships with our equals, and degrees of friendship with our collaborators at work or our neighbours, as well as more intense friendships with those who know our heart deeply and would give their all for us. So there's degrees of friendship. I think there's something parallel in degrees of trust, and it's interesting that Thomas, though he sees trust as essentially a quasi-integral part of faith and hope, when he talks about friendship or charity, he also says that absolutely requires that the two parties feel they can trust each other. And to take your first example, the betrayal people can feel in relationships, and I think of infidelity in marriage and the hurt that does to people, and how very hard it is to forgive and to mend. There are kinds of breach of trust which are terribly damaging. And you might say, well, that's a kind of tears at the soul in a way that an untrustworthy corporation, it's not going to affect me like that. And so it might be different in degree. I don't know if it's entirely different in kind, particularly if that corporation, I'd invested a lot of my hopes and expectations and ideals. Maybe it was my employer, maybe it was Mr. Microsoft, and I thought that everything good came out of computers or whatever. I think some people can have something very similar to the hurt of a broken relationship in the disillusionment with other things that have proved untrustworthy. But it's not exactly the same. You're right.
We have one final question up the back. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for an insightful and thought-provoking lecture, Grace. You mentioned distrust imperils relationships and no doubt threatens evangelization efforts. What role do you think clerical leadership plays in the context of university chaplaincies and rebuilding the trust tertiary students have in church leadership? I know at UTS we've been without a full-time clerical chaplain for a number of years on account of limited clerical availability. Could an oratory perhaps ensure the pastoral needs of university students are met in times like this where priests with capacity to minister and rebuild trust are actually in short supply?
Well, we certainly need more chaplains for universities, so please find me more good priests quickly, because there's lots of things I'd like to do in the universities. I think they're a wonderful mission field where we're going to find the energy and idealism to do lots of good things for our church and our world. So I want more priests. I want them in every university. And I want that partly because I want young people to have spiritual directors and confessors and inspirers and spiritual pastoral leaders. Of course, some of that doesn't require priests, and happily we've got in some of our universities teams of priests, consecrated people, lay people that give a year or 2 years to the task, lots of different people making a team to provide chaplaincy and to provide spiritual leadership. But a pastor has to be part of that team, I think. And so help me find more, please.
Your Grace, it's been said that the sign of a good lecture is not just what we hear, but what we subsequently talk about and chew over, and then on the next day keep thinking about. And I think you've taken us on that journey with framing it in the way that you have, but also leaving us with something to walk out of here tonight, continuing to think about in terms of our witness and our presence and this very important prescient issue of trust. So thank you very much for your wisdom tonight, and would you thank His Grace for such an erudite and significant lecture. Thank you, sir. And thank you all for coming out to Scholarship at the Cathedral. Please stay tuned on the Scholarship at the Cathedral website and through Notre Dame information portals and your other social media access points for 2 more events. We're aiming for September and November. And with a little bit more notice than this one, but also hopefully with equal substance and meaning. So thank you so much. Have a good night and safe travel home. Thank you.